A Murder of Crows by Digby Stevens. Prologue. The weather was cold and rainy. The small country township of Crawley seemed hunched and grey under the leaden clouds. It had been a miserable day, and as evening fell, the clouds seemed to be closing in, the wind whipping the rain sideways on occasions. Two small boys ran through the open side gate to the rear of the church and entered the vestry via the old creaky wooden door. Bustling inside, they flicked the light switch, illuminating the musty, dark, cold, whitewashed room, and headed to the vestment cupboard, removing their white cassocks from the hangers, replacing them with their coats, and slipping them quickly over their outer clothes. Laughing, they pushed and shoved each other toward the tray with the chalice and cloth as it lay waiting in readiness for the Mass. Suddenly the door to the sanctuary opened, and the white-robed figure of Father Andrews entered the room. The giggling silenced instantly, with a stern look from the priest. "Are we ready, boys?" he said, looking from one to the other. Both boys stood meekly gazing up at the priest. His tall, gaunt figure loomed over them as the light globe reflected from his black-rimmed glasses, giving the impression of two glowing yellow eyes. Indicating the tray with its items for the Mass upon it with his large wrinkled hand, he stared at Eamon, who turned and carefully lifted it, whilst Evan opened the door to the church and stood to one side. The wind whistled outside, and the small windows in the back wall rattled, loose in their frames, and draughty with age. Both boys silently passed under the watchful eye of the priest into the dark sanctuary of the church, lit softly by candlelight, and headed for the small side table. Eamon placed the tray upon it in readiness for the Mass. There were already some parishioners seated in the pews, the church interior gloomy and sparsely lit with soft yellow lights. A soft rustle of people adjusting their seating or moving towards their regular spots, bowing to the altar as they did so, echoing in the small, chilly, almost empty church. The boys stood silently at attention beside the table, backs to the cold stone walls, a cue for the organist, who struck up the first notes of the opening hymn. A louder rustle as the small group of faithful rose to begin the opening hymn, as the priest appeared from the vestry door, hands before him as if in prayer, and the Mass began. At the Mass's end, the boys led the way out, carrying the tray with the priest behind them, the organ again filling the church with the musical variation of the last hymn, back into the cold, dim vestry, the soft rustle of the congregation leaving behind them. Mrs. Jacobs would be finishing the piece and closing down the organ in a hurry to meet her husband at the front of the church. The priest, as usual, made his regular jovial comment. That went well, but a small crowd as usual for Saturday." He looked down at the boys' expectant faces. "Maybe the cold weather," he said, and chuckled at his private joke. Saturday night Mass was generally only for the farmers, or those who liked to sleep in on Sunday. "There's just the cleaning up, lads, then you can go." Evan fidgeted, and then summoned up the courage to speak to the priest. "Can I go early, Father? We have visitors, and Mum told me to hurry home." Father Andrews paused and stroked his chin, as if deliberating on some difficult matter, and then smiled. "Yes, Evan, you can go, as long as Eamon doesn't mind cleaning up." He turned and stared down at the young lad, who was unsure as to what to say. "I suppose so, Father," he stammered. In the back of his mind, he was thinking of the cold, dark walk home, and missing Evan's company. The boys were best friends and inseparable, and he wished Evan had mentioned this earlier, so they could have planned a quicker clean-up and leaving together. "Good," said the priest. "I will go and shut up shop, and be back soon." Evan busied himself, removing his cassock hurriedly, returning it to the hanger and slipping on his coat before heading toward the door. He turned to Eamon and spoke. "Sorry," his downturned mouth expressing his feelings, then turned and exited the door to the cold outside. The door closed abruptly, stifling the chilly gusts of wind attempting to infiltrate the already freezing room with its icy fingers. Eamon returned his attention to the tray and began the task of wiping the vessels and then covering them with a white cloth, before removing his own cassock and exchanging it for his woolen jacket and pulling on his cap. The door to the church opened again, and the priest strode purposely into the room. Eamon paused, summoning up his courage to speak to the older man. He always found it difficult to speak to the religious, nuns, priests, and the brothers at school, despite being an altar boy for 8 months now. However, the priest spoke first. "It's a nasty night out there, Eamon. If you wait up a minute, I'll drive you home." Eamon fidgeted on the spot. He wasn't sure what to say. He felt uncomfortable with the idea of being in a car with the holy man, but despite the fact that it was only 4 streets away, he would probably be cold and wet by the time he ran home. No answer seemed to be acquiescence to the old man, who turned and slipped his vestments over his head and hung them in the cupboard by the boys' garments. The silence was uncomfortable, and, seeming to sense this, the priest spoke in his booming voice. "How is that sister of yours? She'll be coming up for her first communion soon, won't she?" Eamon cleared his throat and answered timidly, "No, Father, she's still too young still." Again, silence filled the room as the priest turned, slipping on his jacket and a cap, rather like Eamon's own father wore. "Okay, let's be off," he said, in what was meant to be a cheerful manner, heading for the door and opening it, but the wind pushed suddenly and it flew out of his hand to crash against the wall behind. "Good Lord," he cried, "you would be blown away if you walked home, young Eamon." Lights off, door locked, they both dashed out towards the old black Humber the priest shared, the wind catching the old man's black robes and flapping them like some large dark bird as they ran to the car. Eamon paused at the vehicle, trying to shelter from the howling wind and rain. It was dark all around, and there were no streetlights in this town, too small for that. "Hop in, son," the priest called above the roaring wind. "Don't wait on ceremony," as he himself opened the door, which was nearly torn from his hands, and slid inside the dark, cold vehicle. Eamon climbed onto the hard leather seat and hunched himself against the cold as the engine roared to life. The switch flicked and the headlights sprang to life. The priest turned to the young boy and spoke quickly. "Let me help you with that seatbelt, son," as he leaned over to hook the strap around Eamon's shivering body. The boy caught the smell of alcohol on the priest's breath as he huffed and brought the strap around. Probably from the mass, he thought, but it did seem awfully strong. The old man fumbled at the catch by Eamon's side and laughed as he gripped the boy's leg, trying to slide the belt catch into the holder. Then he brought his own strap around and, leaning back, gunned the motor, selecting a gear with the large stick between them, releasing the handbrake under the dash, and the car jerked forward towards the large iron gates visible in the searching headlights. They were off, and the car, heavy as it felt, swerved onto the road and into the dark. "You live off Fascal's Lane, don't you?" the priest asked, glancing at the small boy crouched down on the large grey seat beside him. "Yes, Father," the boy replied, "next to the dairy." The old priest smiled and gunned the car along the main road, the rain pelting down in shining lines beyond the headlight as the wipers slashed back and forth on the windscreen, the view blurry, then clear, then blurry again. It seemed as if the heavens had opened and the water was pouring down, as if a flood were imminent. Suddenly the car lost power as the priest eased off the accelerator, at the same time swerving off the road to the left under some large canopied trees which absorbed the heavy downpour, instead dropping large blobs of water onto the decelerating Humber. The old man turned to Eamon and spoke in a voice which seemed oddly thicker than before. "I think one of the headlights is out. It seems a bit darker on your side. Would you hop out and check, Eamon? There's a good lad." Obediently, the young boy unclipped his belt, opened the door, and climbed out of the vehicle, its engine still humming. Large drops fell on his head from the leafy canopy as he trudged around to the front of the vehicle and looked down at the headlight. It was shining as brightly as the other, and he returned to the passenger side, the door still open as he had left it, and leaned in to speak to the priest, who sat calmly. "It's the same as the other one, Father," he mumbled, and waited for the old man's reply. "Okay, son, you'd better hop back in," was his reply. Again, the voice seemed strangely thick and reminded him of the sounds he'd heard when passing the local hotel on Saturday nights. He again slid onto the hard seat and closed the door. The priest leaned over to grab the seatbelt with his left hand. This time his right hand rested on the boy's thigh and seemed to grip him a little. "You're a good boy, Eamon," he said, and his voice had a kind of rattle to it, as if the old man was having trouble breathing. There was a pause as the priest leaned over him, and his eyes, though barely visible in the darkness, seemed to somehow bore into him through the dark-rimmed glasses. The heavy smell of the alcohol seemed to rob him of air. "You've always been a good lad," the priest continued. "I never thank you enough for the things you do." The hand on his leg seemed to grip deeper and was moving upward towards his stomach. At the same time, the other hand had now released the seatbelt and was moving down his neck towards his chest. Eamon felt uncomfortable, and his body stiffened, but all he heard was the old man's breath rasping in his throat, smelled the alcohol, and began to feel a sense of panic beginning in his guts. The old man moaned a sort of sound, and Eamon's sense of himself retreated deeply within, paralysed as the hands seemed to grow and multiply until there seemed to be hundreds of them all over his body, pinching and squeezing, smothering his whole being. He closed his eyes and heard the wipers slapping time. The world became smaller and tighter, as if a huge snake was wrapped around him, compressing. A large dark tunnel seemed to open, and he fell into it silently screaming as the beast devoured him alone in the darkness.